author of the book, The Consciousness of Sheep, and the website, The Consciousness of Sheep. I am, for my sins, an economic and social scientist. I graduated with a first-class degree from the University of Wales all the way back in 1990 or 1989. Have worked in basically for government as a researcher, as an immediate after university job. Spent a decade running a charity. Before reaching my 50s, I'm now in my 60s, and taking up writing as a way of eking out a living in the sort of post-2008 world that we now live in. So my interests are, I refer to them as the three E's. It's energy, the environment, and the economy, and they're sort of so interrelated, and yet most people don't talk about them in an interrelated way.
Okay, thanks, Tim. I'm Brian Davy. I've got a biography which has got some similarities to yours, except I'm probably 12 years older than you or something like that. I'm 72. I've got a first-class degree as well in economics from the University of Nottingham, actually in 1970, which is a long way before issues of environment and energy and ecology and climate change were very important, or were even looked at by most economists. There were a few. I'd spent most of my life in the voluntary and community sector in Nottingham, particularly in the mental health services, again, like yourself, partly because of problems that I had in my own life. And in more recent years became interested in the ecological crisis and in local economy. And got to know yourself through discovering your ideas are remarkably similar to mine. So we've known each other for about 2 or 3 years, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we're just doing this experimentally because we had lots of phone conversations which were quite interesting, and we thought it might be an idea to try doing the same thing but recording it for other people's interest. And this is a sort of experiment, really.
Yeah.
I suggest we look at, we start one. We've got very similar interests in terms of who we think it's worth listening to and taking ideas from. And I just was looking at, I didn't finish looking at it, but I was just looking at a video which had Richard Heinberg, Gail Tverberg, Art Berman, and Chris Martensen on, and they were sharing ideas about the state of the American and world economy in the current situation of COVID-19, but also the related crisis within the American oil industry. And one of the things which I think you'd mentioned to me before, but I've not heard him say, was Art Berman, who's an oil geologist, saying that he thinks that by the middle of next year, the American oil production will probably be down to third.
Yeah, I actually went and dug out the piece that Dimitri was referring to. What Berman is saying is that there's this sort of projection of the V-shaped recovery that COVID is going to go away, everything's going to go back to normal. What Berman says is, that's interesting because there's only 1/3 of the number of rigs that you would need to bring American oil production back to where it was. So I don't know that he's necessarily saying that production is going to drop to 1/3. Because I think he seems to acknowledge that, well, once things get going, other rigs will be brought back online. But what he is pointing to is there just ain't going to be enough oil for us to go back to where we were. Yeah, and I guess we can argue about exactly how much the deficit is going to be, but a deficit there will be. I think that spells problems, particularly because the American oil fields have accounted for all of the oil production growth over the last decade.
Yeah.
So that I mean, possibly the Russians and the Saudis might have a bit left to take up some of the slack. But that isn't going to happen immediately. So we're looking at shortages, probably a price spike as a result. And that then kicking off another demand side shock to the global economy. Because one of the things I observe in recent crises is that economists don't get supply side shocks. They get the idea that there isn't enough money in circulation or there's too much money in circulation. What they're unable to cope with is the idea that one or more of the essential resources to the economy is suddenly not available. Because they've been taught this idea of infinite substitutability. Essentially, if there isn't any oil left over, then we'll go and find something else. The problem with that is there's nothing that we know of that's available to us in that kind of quantity at the moment to replace oil. We can talk about windmills and solar panels, and that's great for replacing electricity, which is why it's primarily been responsible for getting rid of coal plants. To replace oil, you're likely to have to go back to the coal and use this process the Germans used in the war to turn coal into oil at great expense. But there is currently no liquid, high density fuel that we can use to replace oil. So if oil is in short supply when we try to open up the economy, we will get a price spike. It will mean that demand across the economy is forced down. Ultimately, the price of oil will come back down to what people can afford. But what that implies is we'll be doing a lot less in the aftermath of COVID than we were going into COVID.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things in the discussion that I heard was Richard Heinberg making a point about scale. It wasn't specifically to this point, I can't remember really, but the point about the oil not being there, and the discussion was very much about Art Berman was actually saying that he thought the production in the US would probably be down to a third or a quarter of what it had been, say, a couple of years ago. The point about something like this is you have to take into account the scale and the speed with which things can be fixed, and you simply can't fix, even if it were possible to introduce solar panels and wind turbines and so on, you wouldn't be able to fix a problem of that scale that quickly. And what COVID-19 has done is it's brought forward problems which were on their way to happening anyway, and it's made them happen a lot quicker because oil was in crisis. The global economy from a debt point of view is increasingly in crisis, that the debt is far too high, so that people are having to commit large proportions of their income, and companies, to debt servicing and so on, which leaves them less discretionary expenditure. So these things were on their way to happening. But what COVID has done is it's brought these problems forward by a massive reduction in the demand for oil, and therefore the price of oil, and therefore a crisis within the oil sector.
Yeah, I mean, one way of looking at it is they've created a demand side shock in order to head off, or accidentally in order to head off, a coming supply side shock. So rather than now having to face a shortage of oil, because global oil extraction peaked sometime in 2018, so we were already feeling the effect of that. What they've now done through the various responses to COVID is to create a demand side shock that has actually removed so much demand from the economy that demand for oil, it doesn't matter that the amount of oil being extracted has gone down, because our demand for it has gone even further down. The problems arise when you try to open up again.
But Turvo said that if you think of human needs for energy, one of the things that, and you've got an energy crisis because the energy isn't going to be there. one of the things that this crisis has done is it's artificially reduced the demand for energy. So in a sense, it's like you've got a lot of people who need 2,000 calories a day or 2,500 calories a day. And you say, well, you're not going to need it now because you can't go out. You can't get in your car. You can't leave the city. You can't do this. You can't do that. So you're that's not on the surface what it's intended to do. It's to prevent virus skipping from one person to another, but it has having the same effect. But of course, when you do that, you also remove the incentive and the resources for the oil companies to invest to keep production going in the future. So you're bringing the crisis forward, basically, and it's happening. It's happening now.
Yes, I mean, the other thing I've been working on this week, I got interested because the British media picked up this story about how cargo ships have stopped sort of calling in at British ports. Typically, the British media is covering it as a Brexit story, because I think the establishment media are just incapable of seeing the economy other than through the prism of Brexit. So when I looked at it, as I wanted to get at, well, you know, Brexit hasn't happened yet, so why should there be problems sort of importing stuff now? The answer is because global supply chains are now so disruptive that it's no longer profitable for ships to bother dropping off in Britain. So all of the big container ships that travel around the world from China to Europe and sometimes across the Atlantic to the States, because the number of those has been cut, basically you get getting more and more cargo is being loaded onto less and less ships, as it were. But then that means that there isn't any more a British container ship to bring in. There's a European one that has a handful of British containers on it. And what they're finding is it's cheaper to dump the British containers over in Rotterdam. And then hopefully a smaller ship will come along later on in the month and pick those containers up and bring them across. There's the problem with that is it's costing, it's doubled the price of container shipping. And as a result, that's crushing demand on this side of the channel, because if you can't afford to do it, you can't afford to do it. But anyway, dig deeper below that one, and what we're seeing is companies scrapping ships. And it's rather similar to oil companies scrapping wells. That having scrapped them, they ain't going to be there if you try to open the economy up again. So in a way, I've said all the way through the COVID crisis that it's been a bit like a phony war. In a sense, in the winter of 1939-40, they knew the German panzers were going to come over the horizon one day, but it went on for months where they never arrived, and it lulled people. We've been in this sort of economic phony war for the best part of a year now, where we know that things are going to go badly wrong at some point. But because thus far it hasn't happened, people are lulled into this belief that we haven't actually damaged anything. Now, I think the shipping issue, along with the oil issue, that's evidence that the damage has been done.
Well, that's interesting, because I read an article in The Economist yesterday which argues that differently. It says one of the problems is that there's been a surge in imports, and the reason for the surge in imports is that a number of companies are stockpiling in advance of the expected disruptions of Brexit. So that they're stockpiling components that they probably wouldn't be able to get hold of during a Brexit transition crisis. You got
that? Now, one of the ways that manifests is you end up with ships anchored up all the way around the British Isles, full of containers that can't be unloaded anywhere. So in a sense, that isn't a separate, I think the two are linked. One of the problems with shipping globally is there's a massive shortage of empty containers. That suggests to me that around the world, there are a lot of ships sitting at anchor with full cargo loads that nobody has space to do anything with. And the primary reason for that is because the economy is operating at about somewhere between 2/3 and 3/4 capacity to what it was at the beginning of the year. If you have a look at one of these real-time shipping maps where you can find out where all the ships around the world are, So in my part of the world, in South Wales, one of the things I've looked for is in St Bride's Bay in West Wales. It's like a natural harbour close to Milford Haven oil port. At the moment, it is full of tankers waiting to unload. And effectively, that's just temporary offshore storage, because there isn't the demand for fuels in the UK, given where the economy is just now. So essentially, until those tankers have unloaded that oil, there's no shipping available to go get the next oil.
Yeah.
I guess the same is true of cargo ships around the world as well. So on the one hand, you have cargo ships that are full of cargo at anchor, waiting for the economy to pick up to use that cargo. On the other, you have empty cargo ships that are no longer profitable that are being scrapped. As I say, my problem is that we are destroying the economy's capacity, so that when we do attempt to get things going again, something as essential as shipping just ain't going to be there.
At any event, what the idea that there's a surge in imports because it's anticipated that there's going to be a crisis says something quite powerful, really. It means that entrepreneurs, businesses, companies all the way around the world are expecting a big crunch. And so they're it's like you expect a bad harvest, so you stockpile. And everybody's stockpiling for a crunch that everybody is expecting. And I think that's quite a significant thing.
Yes, and it's interesting that there's this sort of schizophrenia in the media between the sort of happy clappy stories about how people are now going out and doing their Christmas shopping and isn't it great, and the more serious, sort of you have to dig to the back of the news sites to find the genuine economic news, which is that demand slumps after the initial, when they let us all out of our houses for a bit. Basically, we get this sort of spike of consumption for a couple of weeks, but then it drops away again. The problem is that people aren't spending in anything like the amounts that they were prior to the crisis.
I may say that in Nottingham, just now, we had the city council organised a Christmas market. And there was exactly a real surge into this Christmas market, so much that because of the COVID fears, they cancelled it halfway through.
Yes.
I mean, it's actual absolute complete disaster from the point of view of the city council planning, and also from the point of view of the people who had, rented stores and things like that to sell the thing.
Yeah, I did. Yeah, I mean, the logic behind what they're doing, I think, doesn't stack up. It almost feels like people that are sort of casting around in the dark, wondering what the hell we do. There's that balance of, we need to keep COVID under control, but we need not to completely trash the economy. It strikes me that actually they've trashed the economy almost by accident. Which again goes back to my point about the phony war, that there was enough scope in the British economy, certainly after years of austerity, for government just to print money and hand it out without triggering all of the inflation that everyone feared. To a degree, they've been able to do that. So that's warded off the crisis. That having furlough schemes that protect people's wages, it was actually quite a good policy. I mean, unusually from a Tory government. It's the sort of thing you would have expected a Labour government to come up with, that basically rather than give unconditional bailouts to big companies, you make the bailout conditional on keeping the people in work. That's actually quite a sensible thing to do. And undoubtedly that has cushioned the blow that otherwise would have come. The problem with it, I think, is even with the furlough scheme, you have people whose income has gone down by, a third. There's a lot of employers, although the government sort of says, oh, well, employers can top up your wages. Well, a lot of employers haven't got any income coming in with which to do that. So yes, they've kept people's jobs and they've kept some of the demand in the economy, but demand has gone down generally. The other point is a lot of people in Britain were in debt prior to this. So one of the places that extra government spending has gone to is paying off debts, not fueling more consumption. I'm not seeing any evidence to suggest that we're going on a credit card binge at the moment either, which is what you'd have to do to get levels of demand back up to where they were. So I think in a sense, we have created that demand side crisis. And we're seeing, I mean, in Britain, the biggest employment sector is retail and hospitality. And we're seeing tens, if not hundreds of thousands of jobs being lost there. That is going to come and bite us in the backside later on. But the problem is what happens at a global scale, because actually what happens in the British economy is not going to be enough to actually affect the price of global commodities. If the USA is going down a similar road to us, then yes, an oil shock next year is going to be quite devastating. But if demand across the wider world picks up, then perhaps it isn't such a, so rather than getting the demand side crisis, then you get the supply side crisis. I tend to think Britain is probably just in this unique position of having the worst of all worlds.
Yeah. So, can we look at the effects of all this on public sector finance, government finance, taxation, and things like that? Because that's quite important. I mean, the stuff I've been reading recently is saying that local authorities and central government are in a serious crisis in regard to their own funding. And if I may mention Nottingham, because I live in Nottingham, it's had a series of disasters impacting on the local authority. First of all, the local authority got involved in promoting a company to be involved in the electricity supply market, Robin Hood Energy, and that crashed because it was the victim of what's called the utility death spiral, which has hit a lot of small electricity companies, as you know, and but that has actually hit the local authority. I think it left them with 35 million less. Then the local authority was also involved in joint planning and development with the redevelopment of a shopping centre called the Broadmarsh Shopping Centre. That crashed as well, leaving Nottingham City Council with £9 million less. And then on top of that, there are of course, if they are making it almost impossible for the pubs and the city centre and so on to operate, you can expect that a lot of other companies are going to find it really difficult to meet their council tax payments in the coming years. So there is a discussion in Nottingham about whether the Nottingham City Council will go bust or not. Of course, you have the leader of the City Council saying, no, that's not going to happen. But I can see these problems are not going to go away. They're a sign of the times, and then they're also going to feed up to national government. If you have a deep recession and a lot of people are in serious financial difficulties, their ability to pay their taxes is also going to be reduced, and the amount of income from which taxes can be taken is going to be reduced. So it raises questions about whether government spending, where it's going to come from, and the whole issue, which has economists have been talking in the last few years about whether it's okay for governments how governments can fund their deficits, and modern monetary theory and all those kinds of things. I wonder if I can chuck all that at you and see what you think about that.
I think the British flaw with modern monetary theory is, it's only a flaw because of the way the global monetary system works, that we ultimately have to exchange into dollars. So essentially any attempt to print money here, which And I mean, there is scope to do this. So I don't want to poo-poo the idea. I mean, after years of austerity, and to a degree, we've seen some of it. The Bank of England did what they call monetizing. It was 150 billion of government debt. What it effectively means is the Bank of England created 150 billion pounds out of thin air, gave it to the people who were holding the bonds that are the vehicle for British debt, and bought that debt back. So that, if you like, the government effectively owes the Bank of England that 150 billion now. And because here the Bank of England is actually a government body, unlike the Fed in America that's a private body, here it means effectively the government owes itself 150 billion. The closest I could get it in terms of like these sort of household analogies that don't really stack up, but it would be like if you had a sort of building society savings account and your current account, and what you actually owe is, you owe 150 pounds to your savings account because you borrowed that to pay into your current account. So at the end of the day, you don't actually owe anybody this. It's an accounting device. So there is certainly scope for the Bank of England to do more of that. That essentially let's buy up, and particularly local government debt, because that's a big issue. This was, if you go back to the early Blair years, where Blair encouraged these, what they called private-public initiatives. It was all about how the private sector were going to lend the public sector money to go and build schools and hospitals and office blocks. The problem with it is the way they were set up was you started out with a low interest rate, but the interest rate grew over the period. So a lot of local government people got into those loans and were encouraged to do so by the Blair's people. I mean, it looked good on paper at the beginning because you paid this very low interest rate at a time where interest rates were pretty high across the economy. But then fast forward to today, and you have local governments that are paying off billions of pounds of debt at incredibly high interest. So there is certainly scope there, if government chose to monetize that debt. Now, whether they will do, I don't know. Probably they will do it when all other avenues have failed. So it is very likely sooner or later we're going to see local councils go bust. Whether Nottingham gets that honour or not, I don't know. But, the government has already tweaked the way in which local councils report to central government over their finances, so that councils that are already de facto bust don't look bust on paper. And of course, as you rightly point out, I mean, if we destroy retail and hospitality, that's one of the biggest sources of local government funding through the business rates. It's effectively destroying British high streets through the retail apocalypse. Isn't just destroying shopping, it's destroying local government source of income. So in a sense, you have that double whammy that on the one side, they're hugely indebted and they can't really afford it, and their source of income to pay it off is no longer there. And unlike central government, local government can't print money out of thin air.
And you've got the fact that if people work at home, we've discussed this before, and it's a point you've made. If people work at home, eventually a lot of companies get the idea, well, that's good. You keep on working at home, and then we can just dump this office that we're renting at the moment and save the money which we were paying out on rent. And so you get an increased, an even greater reduction in the use of city centres as the companies dump the rental, and people end up working at home.
Yes, there was a lovely piece of hypocrisy, I think, back in the summer when the government was encouraging people to go back to their offices. There's a news organisation in Britain called Reach, which owns titles like, I think, the Daily Mirror and lots of the regional papers. And I mean, amusingly, the Reach papers were making the argument that we all need to get back to work and get back into the office. Then Private Eye exposed that Reach, the organisation, at the same time had given up, it was 3/4 of its office space in Canary Wharf. So at the same time as telling everybody else to go back to work, they themselves were getting rid of their own offices. And I think, the business case is that you get rid of your office space. Why would you pay rent on a building that you don't need? But yes, the problem for local government then is, well, hang on, the council tax or the business rates on that office block was what kept the council being able to do what it does. One of the things that I think comes out of it is very reminiscent of what was going on in the early 80s, where you had a lot of local government people sort of pleading this case that there were all of these things that they do that are essential. And the government at the time not really caring and cutting back left, right, and center. But you got into this paradox where you were asking people to vote for services that were demonstrably substandard. I mean, quite reasonably, the councils were arguing, well, that's because we don't have the funding and we don't have enough staff. But I think a point I made at a conference back then at the time was basically you're still serving up substandard services. That at the end of the day, you're asking people to vote for you to deliver substandard services, and they're not going to care about the complexities of why we've ended up there. What they want you to do is figure out how to provide a decent service. And if you can't do that, then stop doing it. Now, that may be trickier this time round because councils are pretty much down to the bone on only being able to deliver statutory services. But the sort of thing you would expect to see coming out of this is the top level management of local councils being thinned out and taking wage cuts, as a way of saving the council some of the money that it's spending. It needs that sort of ruthless, if we don't need something, then get rid of it. Because this time round, I think, whereas in the 1980s, it was a government choice to cut local councils, I don't think it's going to be that easy this time round. Yes, they can print money to bail out some of the debts, but I don't think there's going to even a sovereign government that has the ability to print its own money will run into inflationary problems if it tries to bail everything out.
Yeah, there's an article in The Economist as well recently, which says that there's been a lot of discussion over the years about whether printing money leads to inflation or not, and a lot depends on obviously whether you hit resource limits, capacity limits within the economy. But the fear that the inflation will happen has been not very great because interest rates have been so low and there's been spare capacity in the economy. But now maybe there is reason to worry about inflation. And it seems to me that as I said, just said, one of the issues has always been that inflation would happen if demand exceeded supply because you were already at capacity limits for the economy. And that capacity limits for the economy was always measured in unemployed labor. What we're seeing now, though, is the potential that capacity limits wouldn't be just unemployed labor, they would be non-availability of energy because of the energy crisis that we're talking about, and the fact that next year, for example, there might be a really serious reduction in the actual availability of energy. And the discussion within economics about inflation does include energy prices as a source of inflation, and I think that issue is gonna come back.
Yeah, this was the crisis of the early 1970s where you had the oil shocks. I mean, that was the last supply side shock that we faced. And that triggered the spiral of the inflation through the 1970s that led to the neoliberal response. This time around, because then I don't think, there were some economists that actually related it to, look, when your primary energy source becomes unavailable, then you get this price shock through the economy. Actually, it was far more politically advantageous for people to blame profligate trade unions or whoever your particular villain was, you blamed them. So government spending, kind of government overreach. This time round, I'm guessing there'll be a lot of the same sort of stuff going around. But the problem this time is, certainly for the UK. So the UK in 1970 was just opening up the North Sea. So that actually, by the time Thatcher gets into office, the government has oil revenues to cushion everything that it's doing.
Which it doesn't have now.
Yeah, no, the problem is that the North Sea, both oil and gas, peaked in 1999 and rapidly fell to about 30% of what they had been producing. By 2005, Britain has become a net importer of oil and gas. Now, fast forward to today, and we're even starting to be a fairly big importer of electricity. So basically, all of our primary energy is dependent on imports from overseas that we have to pay for in a currency that is regarded as worth the paper it's printed on. So one of the problems with us sort of creating money out of thin air to fund lots of stuff domestically is it devalues the pound against the currencies we need to trade in. Again, yes, you could theoretically create a global currency system that evened that out, which is part of the modern monetary theory. They basically go back to an idea Keynes had, that you'd have an international currency system similar to the internal banking currency system, where the banks trade with each other in something called central bank reserves, which the rest of us don't get to spend. You could similarly have a sort of international monetary reserve that governments that were in surplus would lend to governments that were in deficit. And gradually over time, because if you were in surplus, the cost of your exports would go up, you would gradually fall back down. And if you were in deficit, if exports would fall, so more people would buy them and you'd come back up. And gradually you'd have this sort of equilibrium. So that was part of the theory. The problem is that doesn't exist. That what you have are international currencies that use the sort of arbitrage against each other as a way of sucking wealth into their system. So the American dollar has done it spectacularly well since the Second World War. And the British pound did it in the years after the Industrial Revolution. That, when Britain arrived in India, India was the wealthiest place on earth and Britain was fairly poor. By the time the British left in 1947, India was one of the poorest places on earth and Britain had grown fantastically wealthy. Now, the stock answer is, oh, that was done like the Eddie Izzard sketch about somebody arriving with them planting the flag. And, oh, it was military power that did that. Actually, no, it was the power of the pound. That basically you could tell the Indian principalities, if you want the industrial goodies that we're producing, you need to borrow pounds to pay us in the currency that we insist on in order to have access.
Behind which was the power of coal.
Yes. Yes, I mean, without coal, Britain would still be in the Middle Ages. Or we'd have followed suit eventually behind somebody else that would have done it probably better than we did. The reason that Britain industrialized first in Europe, it's one of the paradoxes with it, and it's overlooked today, that if you look at, I think it's Eric Hobsbawm's Industry and Empire, where he goes through a list at the beginning of the book of all of these factors that had to occur for an industrial revolution to take place. Actually, at the end of this big list of, the coal has to be there has to be iron ore, there has to be lime, there has to be the wealth from the empire, that's, the Atlantic trade, a whole series of things that he puts together. But when you go through them, you can say, well, France has all of those. So why doesn't France industrialize at the same time? The big answer is at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, Britain had a huge labor shortage. It became advantageous and profitable in Britain to invest in technology as a way around the labor shortage, whereas everybody else could fall back on pools of excess labor. So essentially, you want the job done, pay somebody the minimum wage and get on with it. In Britain, you had to go for the machinery. So British workers were then the first to become machine minders rather than direct producers. Add to that the power of coal and you have the makings of the Industrial Revolution. It becomes pretty unstoppable. The thing that stops it in the end is we run out of coal. I suppose the broader 20th century thing then is that America has lots of oil and oil is a damn sight more powerful than coal could ever be.
Yeah, we ran out of coal. Britain started to decline, but then, thank goodness, we discovered oil in the North Sea. Now we've run out of oil in the North Sea.
Yes, I mean,
fall to bits.
Thatcher was given, Thatcher got 18 years in office out of it, or The Tories got 18 years in office out of it. Blair dined out on it. And sadly, by the time you get to dear old Gordon Brown arriving in number 10 Downing Street, the oil's gone. The economy is floating into deficit because our main revenue stream has gone. We're dependent on a city of London and a banking and finance system that itself depends on the revenue from the North Sea to keep the value of the pound up. And suddenly its stability is gone. And dear old Gordon has to go to the country in 2010 to persuade everyone to vote Labour, and we're not having it. And then you usher in this sort of Tory Lib Dem austerity, which pisses people off enough to the point that they vote in favour of Brexit. And so the spiral of decline goes on. But these are crises that go back decades.
But the next stage of these crises is probably going to happen like a hammer blow. And I don't think people appreciate that. So when I talk about inflation, I mean, the weakness in the argument about inflation is that simply people can't afford to pay higher prices for essentials. So what it means is that the amount of money that they've got left over in their pockets to pay for anything else just evaporates. They've got this discretionary expenditure crisis that simply people have got nothing left when they paid the bills, when they paid the taxes, and when they paid the servicing on their debts. There's nothing left in their pockets. And at that point, what happens?
Well, so okay, this is why I talk about a possible price spike in oil rather than a price rise in oil. Because I think essentially once we have a shortage of oil, then whoever the highest bidder is going to get the oil that's out there. So, okay, that drives the price up. As you rightly say, that because oil is ubiquitous, I mean, everything that we have is either made from oil or it was created with machinery that runs on oil or it was transported on vehicles that run on oil. So there's no way we can escape that price spike filtering through. What that does is it forces us to think through, I mean, it's almost like Maslow's hierarchy of needs stuff. But what do I need to spend money on? Because my income isn't going to go up to account for the price of the spike in oil prices. So I need to spend oil on keeping a roof over my head, on having food in my stomach, having clean drinking water, I guess access to utilities, a degree of warm clothing, but there'll be a whole raft of things depending on where you are in the income ladder that aren't essential. So I don't need a television. I don't need a car particularly. So those start to be things that people are forced to say, well, what do I do here? Which do I give up? I mean, I advise everyone to give up television just because television warps your brain anyway. Well, you don't need to be paying the government, 160 quid a year for a television license for them to fill your brain with propaganda.
I agree. We're gonna have to wind up soon, Tim, because
so anyway, I think
it's nearly run out.
Yeah, I think we've got to where that.
I'd to say that if in a situation like this, what does economic policy look like? There's a consultation in Nottingham about Nottingham's future economy. And I've just read the document, and it focuses on culture and the digital economy. And I think culture in the future has to be free, otherwise people won't have it. You can't because discretionary expenditure goes down. You put your priority on food, and an economic strategy has to go down Maslow's hierarchy of needs and focus on how people can help grow their own food again and how people can save energy. It's essentially an economic strategy based on saving things and coping as much as possible on less, and an assumption that your economic strategy is based on growing the economy and on more discretionary expenditure is kind of upside down, seems to me. And so you've got about 4 minutes to discuss that.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think there are these almost two divergent views of what we do. There's the majority one, which is very techno-utopia. So I think I was reading the articles about this meat that they've created out of cell cultures. So apparently we're going to do away with a lot of agriculture and just grow meat in petri dishes, and that will solve our food crisis. And of course, we're all going to be producing digital products rather than real products. The problem with that view ultimately is you have no energy basis behind it. That the energy you need to power that vision of the future just isn't there. Therefore, it isn't going to happen. Bits of it will happen. So yes, it makes sense if you're in the right position to put up a wind turbine or a solar panel and have some batteries to sort of provide you with some electricity. I mean, people will do that. What we're not going to do is power an industrial economy on pre-industrial technologies. The other thing that's likely to happen, I picked up Tim Morgan's latest article, which I think is going down the right road, that he talks in terms of the current economy is very much mass consumption and mass refuse, that we buy things, use them for a bit, they break down, we throw them away, we get another one. Now, what he's looking at is this shift towards what he calls craft production. So it's essentially, we'll be buying a lot less, but the things that we're looking for will be far more handcrafted and made to a far higher quality standard. There's an old Russian saying about, I'm too poor to afford cheap shoes. Yeah. I think, what was his name? Terry Pratchett picked it up that, basically the pair of shoes that you need cost $50, but the average wage only allowed people to buy shoes for $35. Therefore, everybody ended up with wet feet and holes in their shoes. That if you like, the way we've been living is that we've been buying cheap shoes in the knowledge that we can throw them away and get new ones. What we're moving to is an economy where shoes are hard to come by, and that therefore you need to save up and buy the best pair you can get.
Got to just say, though, that there is still a place in this economy for high tech in the form of the internet, because without the internet at the moment, anyway, we'd lose the entire knowledge of civilization, because we've put everything on the internet, and without it, we're nothing.
This is why I think, if you look at central government, its planned infrastructure spending is backward looking, because it's looking at things like roads and rail, the high-speed rail. They're all things that are going to be superfluous. Whether HS2 even gets built, it might well turn out that the debt crisis becomes too great to continue funding it. But this idea that we'll build roads, because when you build roads, more people get cars and that stimulates growth. That economy is gone. The economy of the future would be better served by government finishing off the job of providing high-speed broadband, which is similar in resource terms and in the amount of work that's involved in doing it. So if you're going to do anything, forget putting investment into roads. They're not going to be necessary.
And make that internet economy and internet and broadband intermittent, tolerant, so that it can actually survive the fact that when the wind isn't blowing, the electricity supply will probably go off.
Yes, I don't know whether, I have no idea what backup the various server farms have these days. But again, if you were looking at where to put your batteries, put them in the server farms rather than allowing people to buy them for their own houses.
I don't know whether you know, the FASTA, the organization we've both got links to, has followed a guy called Krista Decker's model for developing a website which is based on solar and is intermittent tolerant.
Yeah.
So I think that we need to go on that sort of direction more.